The early morning sun painted streaks of orange and pink across the sky as Dr. Sarah Thompson's black SUV pulled up to the gates of Lincoln Private Airfield. The clock on her dashboard showed 6:45 a.m., exactly 45 minutes before their scheduled takeoff. Sarah always made sure to arrive early. It was one of the many habits that had helped her climb to the top of her field. She checked her reflection in the rearview mirror, making sure her dark curly hair was neatly tied back in its usual professional bun. Her NASA pin gleamed on the lapel of her navy blazer, and her identification badge hung properly around her neck. Even after 15 years at NASA and countless flights, Sarah still followed her pre-flight routine with careful attention to detail. The security guard at the main gate recognized her car and waved her through with a friendly smile. Sarah had been here many times before, but today was different. Today, she wasn't just another scientist or engineer. She was the mission commander for Project Stratosphere, one of NASA's most ambitious atmospheric research projects of the year. As she parked her car in the designated spot, Sarah could see the sleek white private jet waiting on the tarmac. Its smooth surface reflected the morning light, and the NASA logo on its tail stood out clearly against the bright blue sky. The sight made her smile. That aircraft carried millions of dollars worth of specialized equipment, and soon it would help her team collect vital data about changes in the Earth's atmosphere. Sarah gathered her things: a leather briefcase containing the flight manifest, mission protocols, and team credentials, her laptop bag with all the necessary research data, and a small carry-on with personal items. Each item had its place, organized with the precision that had become second nature to her over years of scientific work. Other team members were starting to arrive now. Dr. James Chen, our deputy commander, pulled into the parking spot next to hers in his red Tesla. Behind him, she could see Dr. Emily Rodriguez and Dr. Michael Park arriving together, carpooling as usual. They were all brilliant scientists, handpicked by Sarah for this mission because of their expertise and dedication. "Good morning, Commander," James called out as he stepped out of his car, giving her a respectful nod. The title still felt new to Sarah, even though she had earned it through years of hard work, countless published papers, and successful research projects. She had broken through multiple barriers to reach this position, being both black and a woman in a field historically dominated by white men. The cool morning air carried the smell of jet fuel and freshly cut grass as Sarah led her team toward the security checkpoint. Her heels clicked steadily against the concrete, setting a confident pace. She carried with her not just her credentials and the mission documents, but also the responsibility of representing hope for other young black girls who dreamed of careers in science. In her hand, Sarah held the flight manifest, a document detailing every person, piece of equipment, and research objective for their mission. The packet was thick with information: atmospheric sampling protocols, emergency procedures, and coordination plans with ground control. She had reviewed every page multiple times, ensuring nothing was overlooked. The private jet stood waiting, its stairs already lowered in preparation for boarding. Sarah could see the ground crew performing their final checks, moving around the aircraft with practiced efficiency. The morning sun now fully illuminated the airfield, promising clear skies for their flight, perfect conditions for their research. As they approached the security checkpoint, Sarah felt the familiar weight of leadership on her shoulders. Her team of 12 scientists and technicians would be looking to her for guidance today. The mission ahead was complex. They would be collecting data about atmospheric pollutants at various altitudes, information that could help shape environmental policies and our understanding of climate change. Little did Sarah know that the biggest challenge of the day wouldn't be the complex atmospheric measurements or the coordination of her research team. It would be something much more personal, a reminder that despite her achievements and position, some people would still see her through the lens of their own prejudices first. The security checkpoint stood between Sarah and her team's waiting aircraft. Guard Richard Miller sat in his small booth, his blue uniform pressed and crisp, but his face wore a permanent frown that deepened as he watched the group approach. Sarah led her team confidently, holding their credentials ready as she had done countless times before. Miller's eyes swept over the group, deliberately skipping past Sarah to focus on her white colleagues behind her. His gaze settled on Dr. James Chen, who stood slightly behind Sarah's right shoulder. "Good morning, sir," Miller said to James, completely ignoring Sarah's presence. "May I see your credentials?" Sarah stepped forward, maintaining her professional composure. Good morning, she said clearly, extending her NASA identification badge and the flight manifest. I'm Dr. Sarah Thompson, Mission Commander for Project Stratosphere. These are my team members, and we're scheduled for takeoff at 7:30 a.m. Miller's expression shifted, his eyebrows rising slightly as he looked at Sarah, then back at her credentials with exaggerated skepticism. He took her ID badge, turning it over in his hands multiple times, as if expecting to find evidence of forgery. Behind her, Sarah could hear her team members shifting uncomfortably. These will need additional verification, Miller said, his tone dismissive. He waved James and the other team members forward. The rest of you can proceed through security while we sort this out. He emphasized the word sort in a way that made it clear he doubted Sarah's authority. Dr. Emily Rodriguez, one of Sarah's senior researchers, stepped forward. But she's our mission commander, Emily protested, her voice tight with indignation. Sarah raised her hand slightly, signaling Emily to stay calm. This wasn't the first time Sarah had faced such treatment, and she knew from experience how to handle it. Miller picked up his phone, deliberately taking his time as he dialed numbers. Protocol, he muttered, not making eye contact with Sarah. Can't be too careful these days. He continued checking other team members through security while making Sarah wait, examining their credentials with only a cursory glance. The morning sun was getting stronger now, and Sarah could feel sweat beginning to form under her blazer. But she stood perfectly still, her expression neutral, years of similar experiences having taught her that showing any sign of frustration would only make things worse. She watched as Miller repeatedly glanced at her from the corner of his eye, clearly expecting her to become angry or leave. Is there a problem with my credentials? Sarah asked calmly, her voice carrying the authority that had earned her respect in countless scientific conferences and NASA briefings. They're identical to those you just approved for my team members. Miller's face reddened slightly. Ma'am, I'm just following procedure. We get all sorts of people trying to access private aircraft. I need to make absolutely sure everything is legitimate. His emphasis on legitimate carried an unmistakable undertone of bias. The rest of Sarah's team had stopped moving through security now, standing in solidarity with their leader. Dr. James Chen had pulled out his phone, quietly documenting the interaction. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Sarah maintained her professional demeanor, though inside she felt a familiar mix of frustration and determination. She had earned her position through years of dedicated work, a PhD in aerospace engineering, countless research papers, successful missions, and breakthrough discoveries. Yet here she was, being treated like an imposter because of the color of her skin. I understand the importance of security, Sarah said, her voice steady and clear. However, my credentials are in order, and we have a strict timeline for our mission. Would you please explain exactly what additional verification you need? She kept her tone professional but firm, years of leadership experience evident in every word. Miller shuffled papers on his desk, avoiding direct eye contact. The security camera above his booth blinked its red light steadily, recording every moment of this interaction. Sarah knew that sometimes the best way to fight discrimination was to let it expose itself, to let the evidence speak for itself. The morning breeze carried the sound of the jet's engines being tested in the distance, a reminder of the important mission waiting for them. But first, Sarah would have to deal with this all-too-familiar obstacle, one that had nothing to do with science and everything to do with prejudice. The situation at the security checkpoint was growing more tense with each passing minute. Guard Miller had now spent 15 minutes verifying Sarah's credentials, while the scheduled takeoff time drew closer. The morning sun beat down on them, and Sarah could see her team members exchanging worried glances. I've made some calls, Miller announced, his voice carrying a hint of satisfaction. But we're still waiting for confirmation from NASA headquarters. He shuffled some papers on his desk, deliberately taking his time. The clock on the wall behind him showed 7:10 a.m. Their takeoff window was shrinking rapidly. Sarah took a deep breath, remembering similar moments throughout her career. Like the time she was mistaken for janitorial staff at her first NASA conference, despite wearing a presenter's badge, or when a senior scientist had asked her to fetch coffee during her doctoral defense presentation. Each time, she had transformed these moments into opportunities for change. Mr. Miller, Sarah said, her voice calm but firm, I'm looking at the security protocol manual on your desk. Section 4.2 clearly states that NASA mission commanders with Level A clearance require only primary credential verification. My badge and documentation meet all those requirements. Her knowledge of protocols was perfect. She had helped write some of them. Miller's face reddened slightly. He hadn't expected her to know the regulations better than he did. Ma'am, times have changed. We have new protocols now. It was a lie, and everyone present knew it. Behind Sarah, Dr. Rodriguez muttered something under her breath in Spanish, her frustration evident. The sound of jet engines testing in the background reminded everyone of the pressing timeline. Dr. James Chen stepped forward again, his phone still recording. "This is ridiculous," he said, his usually quiet voice sharp with anger. "Our mission commander has provided every required document. We have millions of dollars worth of equipment waiting, and a research window that won't stay open forever." Sarah raised her hand slightly, signaling James to step back. She had handled worse situations, and she knew exactly what to do. She pulled out her phone and opened her email, turning the screen toward Miller. "Perhaps this will help with your verification, Mr. Miller. This is today's flight authorization, signed by NASA's Director of Atmospheric Research. You'll notice my name and photo are prominently displayed." Miller glanced at the email, then back at Sarah's face, his expression a mix of doubt and growing unease. More than 40 minutes had passed since their arrival, and he was running out of excuses. Other airport staff had begun to notice the unusual delay, and several had stopped to watch the situation unfold. "I just need to make one more call," Miller insisted, reaching for his phone again. His hands were shaking slightly now, as he realized he might have miscalculated badly. The security camera above continued recording everything, its red light blinking steadily. Sarah straightened her blazer and looked Miller directly in the eyes. "Mr. Miller, let me be clear. You've spent 43 minutes attempting to verify credentials that you approve for every other member of my team with barely a glance. While you're making your next call, I'll be making one as well, to your supervisor, to the airport management, and to NASA's legal department." The mention of NASA's legal department made Miller freeze. Sarah continued, her voice level and professional. "I'm also concerned about our flight window. Any delay-related costs to this mission will need to be explained in detail. I assume you're prepared to provide a written explanation of why you've detained a Level A cleared mission commander." The air seemed to crackle with tension. Other security guards had stopped their work to watch, and Sarah could hear whispered conversations around them. Her team stood firmly behind her, their presence a silent support. Dr. Rodriguez had her arms crossed, fixing Miller with a steely glare, while James continued recording everything on his phone. Through it all, Sarah maintained her composure, yet her eyes blazed with determination. She had worked too hard and come too far to let this moment derail their mission. Years of experience had taught her that sometimes the best way to fight discrimination was to meet it head-on, armed with knowledge, confidence, and an unwavering sense of dignity. Dr. James Chen had seen enough. As deputy commander of the mission, he felt responsible for stepping in. He moved forward, his phone still recording, but Sarah's slight hand gesture stopped him in his tracks. The look in her eyes told him she had a plan. She always did. "Actually, Mr. Miller," Sarah said calmly, pressing a button on her phone's speed dial, "I believe I can help speed up your verification process." Her voice carried no anger, no frustration, just pure professionalism. The phone began to ring on speaker mode, the sound cutting through the tense morning air. Miller shifted uncomfortably in his seat as a voice answered. "Director Williams speaking." Sarah's call had gone straight through to the head of airport security. The guard's face paled visibly as he realized who was on the line. "Good morning, Director Williams," Sarah replied, her voice clear and steady. "This is Dr. Sarah Thompson, NASA Mission Commander for Project Stratosphere. I'm currently at your main security checkpoint with my team, and we seem to be having some difficulty with our clearance verification. Would you mind assisting Officer Miller?" The silence that followed was deafening. Even the distant sound of jet engines seemed to quiet down. Director Williams's voice came through the speaker, sharp and clear. "Dr. Thompson, the same Dr. Thompson I briefed personally last week about today's mission." Sarah's eyes never left Miller's face as she responded, "Yes, sir, the same." She watched as the color drained from Miller's face. Behind her, her team stood in respectful silence, witnessing a masterclass in professional problem-solving. "I'll be there in 2 minutes," Director Williams said firmly. The line went dead, and Sarah calmly placed her phone back in her blazer pocket. Miller suddenly became very interested in reorganizing the papers on his desk, avoiding eye contact with everyone. The next 2 minutes stretched like honey on a cold day. Sarah used this time to turn to her team, discussing the atmospheric sampling protocols they would be implementing once airborne. Her voice was steady and focused. This delay was just another obstacle to be handled, not a defeat. True to his word, Director Williams arrived exactly 2 minutes later. He was a tall man in his 50s, wearing a crisp black suit and a thunderous expression. His shoes clicked against the concrete as he approached, security badge swinging with each determined step. "Dr. Thompson," he said warmly, extending his hand. "I deeply apologize for any delay. I remember specifically adding your credentials to our priority clearance list after our meeting last week." His eyes turned to Miller, who seemed to shrink in his chair. Sarah shook his hand firmly. "Thank you for coming so quickly, Director. We're working with a rather tight schedule today, as you know. Our atmospheric sampling window is time-sensitive." Her response was professional, focused on the mission rather than the discrimination she'd faced. Director Williams nodded, then turned to Miller. His voice carried the weight of authority and barely contained anger. "Officer Miller, step out of the booth." Now, the command was simple but left no room for argument. As Miller stumbled out, Director Williams personally began processing the team's security clearance. His fingers flew over the keyboard, properly logging their credentials with practiced efficiency. "Dr. Thompson, your team is cleared for immediate boarding. I'll personally escort you to your aircraft." The other security guards watched in silence as their director handled the situation. Some looked embarrassed, others seemed relieved that someone had finally intervened. Dr. Rodriguez whispered something to Dr. Park, who nodded in agreement. Sarah gathered her team with a simple gesture. The moment had passed, but its impact would linger. Years of experience had taught her that sometimes the most powerful response to discrimination wasn't anger or confrontation, but rather a calm demonstration of competence and authority. As they walked toward their waiting aircraft, Sarah could hear Director Williams beginning a stern conversation with Miller behind them. She didn't look back. Her mind was already on their mission, on the atmospheric data they would collect, on the contributions they would make to climate science. This incident, like others before it, would become just another story in her journey. A reminder that change happens one moment, one person at a time. Director Williams stood in front of Officer Miller, holding up the mission briefing folder with NASA's logo clearly visible on its cover. The morning sun caught the gold embossed lettering, making it shine. Miller's face had turned an interesting shade of pale as he stared at the document. "Officer Miller," Director Williams said, his voice carrying across the checkpoint area, "this is the briefing from last week's security meeting, the one where we specifically discussed Project Stratosphere and its importance." He flipped open the folder, revealing a large photo of the mission team. There, at the center of the image, stood Dr. Sarah Thompson, clearly identified as mission commander. Miller's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. His eyes darted between the photo and Sarah, who stood calmly watching the scene unfold. The security camera above continued its silent recording, capturing every moment of his growing discomfort. I was just following protocol," Miller stammered, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. Sweat began to form on his forehead despite the cool morning air. Behind Sarah, several team members exchanged knowing looks. Director Williams's voice cut through the air like a knife. "Protocol? Let's talk about protocol, Miller." He pulled out a tablet and began scrolling through it. "According to our logs, you cleared 11 team members in less than 5 minutes. Yet you spent nearly an hour attempting to verify the credentials of their mission commander." Sarah stepped forward, her NASA pin catching the sunlight. "Director Williams, while I appreciate your attention to this matter, we're working with a tight schedule. Perhaps we could focus on getting our mission underway." Her voice was professional, showing no hint of satisfaction at Miller's discomfort. The director nodded respectfully to Sarah before turning back to Miller. "Officer Miller, do you realize that your actions have delayed a multi-million-dollar NASA research mission? Do you understand that Dr. Thompson is not only the mission commander, but also one of the leading aerospace engineers in the country?" More airport staff had gathered around, watching the scene unfold. Among them, Sarah noticed other security guards shifting uncomfortably, perhaps recognizing similar biases in themselves. This was why she always handled these situations with dignity. Each one was an opportunity for change. Dr. Thompson, Miller said, his voice barely above a whisper, I apologize for the delay. His eyes remained fixed on the ground, unable to meet her gaze. The same man who had dismissed her so easily earlier now couldn't even look her in the face. Sarah acknowledged his apology with a simple nod. Thank you, Officer Miller. I hope this experience will help you approach your duties with more professionalism in the future. Her words were measured, chosen carefully to educate rather than humiliate. Director Williams wasn't finished yet. He held up his tablet, showing Miller's security clearance records. In the past month alone, there have been 3 formal complaints about your selective application of security protocols. This incident will be added to your file, and you'll be required to attend our advanced diversity training program. The other security guards watched intently as their colleague received his reprimand. Some nodded in agreement, while others looked worried, perhaps wondering about their own biases and behaviors. This moment of revelation wasn't just about Miller, it was about systemic change. Sarah checked her watch. Despite the delay, they could still make their research window if they moved quickly. She turned to her team, who stood ready for her direction. Team, let's proceed to the aircraft. We have important work to do. As they walked away from the security checkpoint, Sarah could hear Director Williams continuing his conversation with Miller. Words like suspension and review board drifted through the morning air, but Sarah's mind was already on their mission, on the atmospheric data they needed to collect, on the scientific discoveries waiting to be made. Dr. Chen fell into step beside her. You handled that brilliantly, he said quietly. As always. Sarah gave him a small smile. In her 20-year career, she had learned that sometimes the best response to prejudice was to let people reveal their own biases while maintaining your own dignity and professionalism. Director Williams gathered all the security staff present for an immediate meeting right there on the tarmac. The morning sun was higher now, and Officer Miller stood apart from his colleagues, his face showing a mix of shame and anger. Sarah watched the scene unfold as her team began their final preparations nearby. This incident, Director Williams announced to his staff, will serve as a teaching moment for our entire security department. His voice carried authority and disappointment. Effective immediately, Officer Miller is suspended pending a full review of his conduct. Miller's shoulders slumped even further at these words. Sarah stepped forward, her NASA badge glinting in the sunlight. If I may, Director Williams, she asked. When he nodded, she addressed the gathered security staff. I've encountered similar situations throughout my career. Rather than simply punishing past mistakes, perhaps we could focus on preventing future ones. The security staff listened intently as Sarah continued, her voice clear and professional. I would be willing to help develop a new training program for your security team, one that addresses unconscious bias and promotes professional conduct regardless of a person's appearance, gender, or race. Director Williams's eyes lit up at the suggestion. Dr. Thompson, that's incredibly generous of you, especially after what just happened. He turned to his staff. This is what true leadership looks like, turning a negative experience into an opportunity for growth. Miller, who had been staring at the ground, finally looked up. Dr. Thompson, he said, his voice barely audible. I don't know what to say. I've worked here for 12 years and He trailed off, unable to finish his sentence. Sarah responded with professional grace. Officer Miller, what matters now is not what happened in the past, but what we learn from it. Change begins with acknowledgement and continues with education. Her words carried no bitterness, only wisdom gained from years of similar experiences. The other security guards nodded in agreement. One of them, an older woman, stepped forward. Dr. Thompson is right. We all need to do better. I've seen similar things happen before but never spoke up. That stops today. Director Williams pulled out his tablet and began typing. Dr. Thompson, once your mission is complete, would you be willing to consult with our HR department? We need to overhaul our entire training protocol. His fingers moved quickly across the screen, already making notes. Sarah checked her watch. They were still within their mission window, but barely. I'd be happy to help, Director. My assistant can contact your office next week to arrange the details. For now, though, we have important atmospheric data to collect. The security staff began to disperse. many of them approaching Sarah to personally apologize for not intervening sooner. Miller remained where he was, watching as his colleagues showed their support for the change that was coming. Dr. Rodriguez approached Sarah with their final equipment checklist. "Commander, everything's ready for boarding," she reported, then added quietly, "You just taught them more about leadership in 10 minutes than they probably learned in 10 years. Sarah gathered her team with a simple gesture. As they walked toward their aircraft, she could hear Director Williams beginning to implement immediate changes. He was assigning new security pairs, ensuring more diverse teams at each checkpoint. It was a small start, but an important one. The private jet stood waiting, its engines humming softly in preparation for takeoff. Sarah's team began boarding, each member nodding respectfully to their commander as they passed. They had witnessed not just the handling of discrimination, but a masterclass in professional leadership. From the corner of her eye, Sarah saw Miller being escorted to the security office, his badge already removed. She felt no joy in his punishment, only hope that this incident would lead to real change. Sometimes, the best way to fight discrimination was to transform it into an opportunity for education. As Sarah prepared to board the aircraft, Director Williams called out one last time, "Dr. Thompson, thank you for showing us a better way forward." She turned and gave him a small smile. In her experience, the most powerful response to prejudice wasn't anger or revenge. It was excellence, dignity, and the willingness to help others learn and grow. Inside the private jet, Sarah quickly shifted her focus to the mission at hand. The cabin hummed with activity as her team of 12 scientists and technicians settled into their stations. The earlier incident at the security checkpoint felt like a distant memory now. There was important work to be done. "Team, gather round," Sarah called, standing at the front of the cabin. Her voice carried the same confidence it had shown during the confrontation, but now it was directed toward their scientific goals. The team quickly formed a circle around her, tablets and notebooks ready. "Despite the delay, we're still within our optimal window," Sarah said, pulling up a holographic display of their flight path. "Dr. Chen, what's the status of our atmospheric sampling equipment?" Her deputy commander checked his tablet before responding. "All systems are green, Commander," James reported. "The new sensors are calibrated and ready for data collection. We've double-checked the backup systems as well." Behind him, the sophisticated atmospheric monitoring equipment blinked steadily, ready to gather crucial climate data. Sarah nodded and turned to Dr. Rodriguez. "Emily, how are the weather conditions looking for our sampling zones?" The meteorologist pulled up a series of weather maps on her screen, showing clear conditions along their planned route. "Perfect conditions, Commander," Emily replied. "We have clear skies and stable air masses at all our sampling altitudes. The morning turbulence has settled exactly as predicted." Her fingers moved across the screen, highlighting their target areas. The pilot's voice came over the intercom, announcing their immediate takeoff. Sarah looked around at her team, seeing nothing but focus and determination in their eyes. The morning's discrimination had only strengthened their unity. As the aircraft began taxiing down the runway, Sarah moved through the cabin, checking each station personally. Every team member had a crucial role to play in collecting data about atmospheric pollutants and their impact on climate change. This mission could provide vital information for environmental protection policies. The jet lifted smoothly into the air, climbing steadily to their first sampling altitude. Through the windows, the airport grew smaller, the morning's events literally falling away beneath them. Sarah watched as her team efficiently prepared their equipment, their movements practiced and precise. "First sampling zone in 5 minutes, the pilot announced. Sarah took her position at the main monitoring station, surrounded by screens showing real-time atmospheric data. This was where she truly belonged, leading groundbreaking scientific research. Dr. Park, their data analyst, called out from his station, "Commander, I'm seeing some interesting preliminary readings. The pollution levels at this altitude are different from our previous models." Sarah moved to his screen, examining the numbers with practiced expertise. The team worked like a well-oiled machine, each person performing their role with precision. They had trained together for months, and it showed. Even the newest team member, fresh from graduate school, moved with confidence under Sarah's leadership. "Second sampling zone approaching," called out Dr. Chen, adjusting sensor arrays now. The sophisticated equipment hummed as it collected data about particulate matter, greenhouse gases, and other atmospheric components. Each piece of data they gathered could help understand climate change better. Sarah moved between stations, offering guidance where needed, making split-second decisions about sampling parameters. Her earlier confrontation with Officer Miller seemed like it had happened in another lifetime. Up here, among the clouds and scientific equipment, only the mission mattered. "Team, we're getting exceptional readings," Sarah announced, reviewing the incoming data. "The new sensor array is performing even better than expected." A quiet cheer went through the cabin. This was what they had worked so hard for. As they reached their cruising altitude, Sarah took a moment to look out the window. Below them, the world stretched out in a stunning panorama of land and sea. Up here, there were no artificial barriers, no prejudices, just the pure pursuit of scientific knowledge. Dr. Rodriguez approached with a tablet showing their initial results. "Commander, look at these patterns we're detecting. This could be groundbreaking." Sarah studied the data, a smile spreading across her face. This was why she had pushed through every barrier in her career, for moments like this, when their work could make a real difference in understanding and protecting our planet. 2 months after the incident at Lincoln Private Airfield, Sarah sat in her office at NASA, reviewing a report on her computer screen. The morning sun streamed through her window, lighting up the many awards and certificates that covered her walls. But it was the newest document on her desk that brought a smile to her face. The report showed the results of the new security training program she had helped develop for the airfield. In just 8 weeks, the changes have been remarkable. Complaint rates had dropped to nearly zero, and staff surveys showed a significant improvement in workplace culture. The incident with Officer Miller had become a catalyst for real change. Sarah's phone buzzed with a message from Director Williams. "Dr. Thompson, thought you'd like to know. We're implementing your training program at all our regional airports. Your experience is helping transform security protocols across the state." She read the message twice, satisfaction warming her chest. On her desk sat a framed article from the Aerospace Journal. The headline read, "NASA Mission Commander Transforms Airport Security Training After Discrimination Incident." The story had caught national attention, not for the discrimination itself, but for how Sarah had handled it and the positive changes that followed. A knock on her door interrupted her thoughts. Dr. James Chen entered, carrying a tablet with their mission results. "Commander," he said with a smile, "the final data analysis is complete. The atmospheric samples we collected that day are revolutionary. 3 research universities have already requested access to our findings." Sarah nodded, remembering how her team had performed flawlessly despite the morning's challenges. "Send them the data, James. Science progresses through collaboration." She pulled up the atmospheric readings on her screen, the colorful graphs showing patterns that could help fight climate change. Another message popped up on her computer, this one from NASA's head of diversity and inclusion. They wanted Sarah to speak at next month's leadership conference about her experience. She had already received similar invitations from universities and research institutions across the country. The incident had started conversations about discrimination in scientific fields that were long overdue. Sarah had received hundreds of emails from young scientists, especially women of color, sharing their own stories and thanking her for standing up with such dignity and professionalism. Looking out her window at the NASA campus below, Sarah remembered Officer Miller's face when he realized who she was. Last week, she had received a letter from him. He wrote about how the incident and subsequent training had opened his eyes to his own biases. He was now volunteering at local schools, encouraging minority students to pursue careers in science. Dr. Rodriguez poked her head into the office. "Commander, the new security protocols you helped design are being featured in the International Aviation Safety Journal. They're calling it the Thompson Standard for Inclusive Security Practices." Sarah shook her head modestly, but felt proud of the impact. On her wall hung a new photograph, her team standing in front of their research jet, taken right after they had completed their successful mission that day. Despite the morning's challenges, they had collected groundbreaking data that would help understand climate change better. It proved what Sarah had always believed. Excellence was the best response to prejudice. Her computer chimed again. This time it was an email from a young black girl who had read about Sarah's story. "Dear Dr. Thompson, It began, "I want to be a scientist like you when I grow up. My teacher says I can't because I'm a girl, but your story shows me that I can." Sarah immediately began typing a response, encouraging the young girl to pursue her dreams. The morning sun caught Sarah's NASA pin as she stood to prepare for her next meeting. The incident at the airfield could have been just another story of discrimination, but instead, it had become a turning point. It had shown that one person standing up with dignity and professionalism could create waves of positive change. Director Williams had been right that day. Sometimes the best way to fight discrimination was to transform it into an opportunity for education and growth. As Sarah gathered her materials for the upcoming diversity training session, she smiled, knowing that her experience was helping pave the way for the next generation of scientists, regardless of their race, gender, or background.